Welcome back, guys, to the JBS Education Portal Roundtable. We are here with soon-to-be Dr. Rafalo and Mackenzie Baker, and today we're going to be talking all things recovery. So, obviously, recovery is a key ingredient in the training process and is of the utmost importance for anyone who's looking to develop strength, their physique, or even just perform well in the gym and improve week to week over the years and just go about their training in a sensible manner. So I thought we'd kick off the discussion, Marto, with a definition of what recovery actually means, because I think there's quite a lot of subjectivity around how people view this word. So kick it off. What is recovery?
For sure. So recovery is quite a broad term that is commonly used in different contexts. So it's important that we do define it before moving on. So for our purposes today, we're speaking more so about recovery in the context of training. So recovering from a given training stimulus. But you may have also heard recovery being used in terms of maybe recovering from a long-term calorie deficit, like a comp prep, which would involve a slightly different discussion to the discussion we're having today. And I guess considering that today's focus is on recovering from a given training session or stimulus, the next question is, well, what is it exactly we're recovering from though? So we're training and something's happening, and that is the something that we have to recover from. So it's really fatigue that we're needing to recover from. And of course, the way in which we train will determine the fatigue that we incur. And there's many different ways we can design training to manage fatigue. And there's also many different ways we can eat and prescribe nutrition to also help with recovery and to also help manage fatigue. I think from here, it's also a good idea to just break down fatigue and understand its origins, because that will then also allow us to work out exactly how this recovery is taking place and what we need to do to try and maximize recovery in the context of our goals. So I guess we can break down fatigue into what we can call, or what is sometimes in the research called trait fatigue, which would refer to fatigue that is independent of exercise. So someone who may have sleep-related issues, for example, may have a very busy job. So lifestyle stresses that generally cause a certain level of fatigue to linger in the long term. That's something that we have to consider as coaches and just people who train. We can't just consider the fatigue we incur from training. And then we also have exercise-induced fatigue, right? And commonly this is broken down into central and peripheral fatigue. And although that serves its purpose for learning, it's a lot more complicated than that. Like you said, Jacob, there is a lot of subjectivity. So if we think about exercise-induced fatigue for a second, we have fatigue that is going to affect our performance, our motor performance. And that's going to be either originating from the central nervous system, from the muscle itself. It could also be cardiovascular or respiratory. In training, although we are predominantly resistance training, that may be the context of this discussion. There is a cardiovascular and respiratory demand there that would influence our motor performance. But then we also have perceived motor fatigue. So, how we perceptually feel. We might walk into the gym one day and feel fatigued, but actually end up performing quite well. And then there's also cognitive factors too. So you could be cognitively fatigued, and you could also be perceiving some cognitive fatigue. So there are a lot of moving parts. And to layer another factor on top of all that, we also have tissue damage. So when we train, we damage tissue that is predominantly muscle tissue, could also be connective tissue. And so all of these factors that are being influenced by the training stimulus do require some recovery if we are to perform, multiple sessions across the week and progressively overload our training, etc. So I guess recovery would be the diminishing of any fatigue or tissue damage that is causing a detriment in force production from baseline. And that's really what fatigue is doing. It's causing our force producing capabilities to be negatively affected, and recovery is going to allow us to hopefully bring our force production capacity, back to its baseline. So that's what recovery is, and we know now what we're recovering from. And yeah, hopefully we can then take it further and speak about, well, what we can do to manage recovery.
Yeah, perfect. That was very, very detailed, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. But we'll take things over to what we can do to recover from fatigue before we go into discussing more of the training-related factors that induce fatigue. So, Mac, when it comes to nutrition, how much of a role does nutrition play in allowing for or enhancing the recovery from a training session?
Yeah, okay. So it's hard to put a number on it, and I wouldn't have the exact answer to it. But there's no doubt that nutrition definitely has a pretty powerful influencing role on the speed of recovery or the magnitude of recovery. But also, in my view, and I guess a bit of a tangent off what Dr. Martin said there, we also, like, when I think about recovery, I also think promoting training adaptations. And in my view, there's a bit of a difference there because the kind of goal is slightly different. So, for example, if we're in a competition phase, in and around a competition week or something, then, usually, assuming it's a really important competition, the priority is to maximize preparedness. So maximize that recovery so you can produce maximal force output, as Martin said, and perform your best on the day or days, especially if we're talking a multi-day competition. If we're in a training phase, though, and we're seeking those more long-term gains or training adaptations, our approach might be a little bit different, where we're thinking more long game and therefore omitting some of the tools in our nutrition toolkit to try and bolster those training adaptations, but taking a trade-off in that, knowing that our acute recovery might be somewhat not as good as it possibly could be. It's not optimal. But nutrition definitely plays a key role there. And I'm sure we're going to go into the different areas of nutrition that we can talk about here. But it's really a big rock among little pebbles. I would say that in the world of trending fitness stuff, everyone's talking about this, the shiny new toy when it comes to recovery, whether it's a supplement, some kind of hot or cold style therapy, cryo, I don't know. But nutrition, also managing training loads, sleep, stress management, what have you. These are sort of the really big rocks.
Yeah, I think the big rocks is certainly nutrition, as well as getting the training program designed in a way that it doesn't induce an amount of fatigue that cannot be recovered from in whatever time frame the individual's wanting to recover in. So, Marta, if we look at the training related stuff, what variables are going to influence fatigue the most, and how can people pay more attention to the things that are going to maximize the stimulus and minimize the fatigue that comes with their program to ensure that they are recovering in an appropriate time frame before their next workout?
Yeah. So I think it's first important to break training related recovery down into acute recovery and delayed recovery. So when we hear the term recovery, we often think, okay, well, recovery post exercise, and that's something I would term delayed recovery. But we also have to consider acute recovery within a training session that occurs in between sets, because that's also important, and that can also influence, the stimulus that we're achieving across a workout. So acute recovery, like I said, that occurs in between sets. That would consist mostly of removing all the metabolic waste products that build up from a hard set, and from the hard sets that we generally perform during training. The replenishment of phosphocreatine, for example, in between sets as well. That's going to play an important role, and that's where nutrition and supplementation can come into this discussion. In between sets, we're also recovering the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system. So there's a whole lot going on there in between sets that we need to consider, and that the way we align training variables in a program will affect the recovery debt that we have to recover from in between sets. And then delayed recovery, which is occurring post-exercise, that can take anywhere in between 24 to 72 plus hours to complete. That's involving the recovery of any of the central fatigue that we may have incurred from the training session, and also any of that tissue damage that we may have experienced as well, which is likely going to cause us to be fatigued. In fact, the tissue damage, the muscle damage itself, is one of the main mechanisms influencing this delayed recovery that we generally talk about. So post-training, that muscle damage can lead to neural impairments that will affect your force production capacity. So that needs to be considered. And like I mentioned earlier, the way we align training variables will not only influence acute recovery, but also delayed recovery. And the goal here is to align training variables in a way that gives us a sufficient stimulus that is going to promote adaptations, right? It's also going to be a stimulus that we can recover from, like Mac alluded to earlier, so that we can come into the gym in subsequent days and repeat, that similar effort and keep accruing the stimulus we need over time to, experience the adaptations that we're after. So with that said, if we're looking at, training variables, I guess one of the first ones we can consider is the exercise itself. As we know, the way exercises are executed and the features and demands of any given exercise will influence the fatigue costs. And that's going to affect not only your acute recovery in between sets. So an example of this is while performing a barbell squat is likely going to accrue a large, recovery debt in between sets versus something like maybe a side raise, right? So the acute recovery considerations are different between exercises. And that's also likely true when we consider delayed recovery. So if you have a workout, for example, that comprises exercises similar to a barbell squat, they're compound movements, they're very demanding overall, that's going to cause a more prolonged recovery post exercise versus a workout that may comprise just isolation exercises without a very large, systemic demand. So the exercise needs to be considered, and that's where, zooming out and making sure you're designing a workout that involves or comprises exercises that do come with a high fatigue demand, but others that don't, and making sure you have a balance of both is likely a good idea. And then moving on from there, the proximity to failure and the volume of the training we're doing is likely then going to be, they're both going to be the variables that are leading these changes in fatigue that we're experiencing across a workout. So within a set, your proximity to failure is going to no doubt influence the acute recovery that we have to experience, post set and in between sets, no doubt about that. And then the volume of the training that we do, well, of course, that's going to lead to some central fatigue accumulating across a session, but that's also going to play a primary role in the delayed recovery that we need to then experience post-workout as well. So there's a few moving parts here. I think the main ones are the ones I described. So we've got the exercises that we're performing and how we're performing them. We have the proximity to failure that's influencing the fatigue we're going to incur from each of our sets. And of course, the volume, so the number of sets we're doing, well, that's going to influence, the overall fatigue we experience, because the more sets we perform, providing they're close to failure, well, the more fatigue we're going to experience as well. So it's really a balancing act, making sure that we choose exercises accordingly, making sure we're pushing sets close to failure. If we're pushing them very close to failure, maybe we're pulling back on volume and compromising volume. If not, then we have more room to move with volume, and we could go with a higher volume approach. So hopefully that gives some context and a bit of a picture of how these variables can affect the fatigue that we're experiencing and then the recovery costs.
Yeah, I think a lot of people miss the forest for the trees when it comes to recovery issues. If they're not recovering, yeah, they turn straight to a lot of the fads and gimmicks or quick fix, shiny new toys that Mac mentioned, and they don't actually address their training program. And I think that's the first point of call. If you are running into recovery issues, especially if they're at the wrong time, and what I mean by that is if you're having recovery issues in week 2 or even week 3 of your training program, that's probably not a good thing, especially if you're training for hypertrophy and your mesocycles in most cases should be extending beyond, say 5-6 weeks of productive training before you deload. And if you're getting that fatigue and recovery issues before a deload, that's probably not a bad thing. And I think it's really important to make note of that, because fatigue and experiencing the drawbacks of training hard is a very necessary part of the training process for most people's goals who are wanting to take their physique to the next level or improve their strength. And obviously that's a sliding scale. If you're somebody who's training 2-3 times a week and you're just doing it to be healthier and a little bit fitter, you're definitely not going to experience the same level of fatigue and have these kind of recovery considerations as someone who's training 5-6 days a week would, who's a competitive athlete, for example. So I think that's really important to mention. The time period that you're in within your program should determine how much fatigue you're going to be experiencing and what to expect, as well as how advanced you are, because somebody who's more advanced, got more serious goals, they're able to induce a lot more fatigue than someone who's a beginner. A beginner, for example, can't produce much force. They're going to be lifting lighter weights. So it might still be challenging and induce fatigue in other ways, but they're not going to be able to, hurt themselves or induce, that much fatigue as well. Somebody who's able to squat 300 plus kilos, multiple times a week. So, Mac, we kind of touched on it. The big rocks are obviously the training program and how we design that, as Martin said, with our proximity to failure, our volume, and obviously the exercise selection. And then nutrition plays a big role. Which variables are going to play the largest role? And I guess, in what contexts and situations does one variable sort of take precedent to others? For example, carbohydrates, around the workout for somebody who might be performing for endurance versus protein for somebody who's doing resistance training, things like that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways I could kind of address this question. I really like how Martin broke down sort of the time frames. Like he was like acute within exercise session and then afterwards. So I guess I'll start off with the smallest time frame being acute. So if we are training for more than an hour, the presence or the ingestion of carbohydrates is going to prolong or improve or enhance performance over a longer period of time. Okay, so that's a big rock there, as well as hydration. So this is what we're really talking about during exercise. If the exercise session is shorter than an hour and you've got the calories to play with, I don't see any harm in consuming like a carbohydrate containing beverage. And in a lot of instances, people might note things like placebo benefits. I personally, when I have a sports drink during training to my RPE6 intensity levels, then, I feel like I can train harder. So I don't think there's any cons provided you've got the calories to play with. And then post-exercise, I just want to add just quickly there, for most people, those things like the carbohydrates during exercise, it's not really going to be worth worrying about. It's really sort of if you're training very hard or you're an endurance style trainee, you're training for longer periods. That's where those things are going to be more important. Then afterwards, we have the 4 R's. So we've got refueling. So that's carbohydrates. We've got repair, so protein. We've got rest. This really refers to pre-sleep nutrition, actually, or anything that can promote more restful and longer sleep. And then we have what was the last one? Rehydration. Okay, so making sure that you are replacing what you lost. And when I'm talking about what you lost, I'm talking about the fluid that was lost during exercise. Replacing that, you also want to think about electrolytes there as well, which can come from an electrolyte-containing beverage, such as sports drink, or it can come from food. So these are more sort of, I know I extended into the post-exercise window by talking about the 4 R's, but I'm talking more like around training here, okay? Now, really, in general, like over longer time spans, or if we're talking about attaining training adaptations over a long training period, or if we're talking about being prepared over coming into a competition weekend or week, or just that side of recovery, then we have some real major big rocks. And undeniably, the biggest one is going to be overall calorie intake or energy availability. So energy availability is a little bit different to energy balance. So energy balance, obviously, I'm assuming the listeners are going to know, and we're talking calories in, calories out. Energy availability, in layman's terms, essentially refers to what's left over after exercise has been taken care of, as far as how many calories are left over after we've sorted out exercise. Now, when the amount left over falls below a certain threshold, it's called low energy availability. And one of the consequences of low energy availability is impaired recovery and impaired training adaptations. And, people like to focus on having protein at certain times. When do I eat carbohydrates? Not to throw shade at these things. These are all very important. But if your energy availability isn't where it should be, if you're under consuming calories, then your body simply doesn't have the resources to be able to repair and regenerate and, be prepared for the next training bout, be able to perform your best, as well as have the fuel available to, I guess, bolster the training adaptations or the training response, the thing that we're kind of trying to get out of our training. So the big rock there is definitely energy availability. Undeniably, I feel like people just don't place, people know that a reduced calorie intake will affect things like recovery. When people are in a dieting phase, I think it's kind of an unspoken consensus in the lifting community or the sport and exercise community that, hey, my recovery is going to be compromised. I just don't think it gets the attention it deserves because other things normally take precedence. So yeah, energy availability, biggest rock for sure. Then we're looking at protein nutrition, and this can actually be broken up into two parts. We've got total protein intake, and there's a bit of back and forth here, but generally speaking, 1.6 to 2 grams per kilo of protein over the course of the day does the job. I like to simplify it even further, to be honest, and just go a palm-sized serving of a protein-rich food with most of your main meals and a couple of your snacks. You're going to pretty much be guaranteed in that range. Okay. And then we look at the distribution or the timing of protein across the day. So generally speaking, about every 3 to 5 hours, about 0.4 grams per kilo of body weight. So we're, in layman's terms, again, we're looking at spacing our protein across our waking hours via evenly sized, evenly spaced portions to make up that adequate total across the entire day. And then, of course, we want to have enough fats in the diet to promote things like the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, and K. We, of course, want to have carbohydrates because glycogen is essentially the fuel source to strenuous exercise. Glycogen, as I said, is a product of carbohydrate presence. So we're making sure that we are replenishing that, coming back to those 4 hours. And really, to be honest, like the whole macronutrient thing, that feeds up into energy availability or energy intake at the end of the day. So that, as well as hydration status, they're really the big rocks. And then everything else, all your specific timing, not to say that they don't do anything, especially supplements, but they're kind of like these little pebbles, and we wouldn't really have much of a place worrying about those small things until we're consistently nailing those big ones first.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that last point. You don't worry about the smaller, minute details until you've consistently nailed down the big rocks. And this is where I think a lot of people jump the gun when they go and, they jump in an ice bath and they do that, once every 2 weeks. They don't even do that consistently. And I think people would be way better served if they focused on getting the training program right in the first place, because if that's a mess, recovery is going to be a mess, and all the nutrition and sleep in the world isn't going to help you. But then once your training's in a good place, making sure that you're just getting that nutrition right, and probably after nutrition is sleep. So I thought it'd be a good idea to discuss that. Marto, what role does sleep play in this recovery process?
Great question. So like I mentioned earlier, we could classify sleep as obviously not being exercise induced. So it's still going to cause fatigue. It's going to cause fatigue that will linger from day to day and over time. And I think we've summed it up really well so far. If we can get our training programming right, if we can ensure that our nutrition corresponds well with our training, and our energy availability is in the right place and is sufficient. If we can do those two things and ensure we're sleeping well, then recovery is going to be less and less of an issue over time. And that really is the environment that we want to promote the adaptations that we're after. So, the adaptations that we generally discuss, muscle hypertrophy, force development, etc. Most of these physiological processes are energy expensive, and we want to be in a state where our nutrition is replenishing our energy stores. We have enough energy available. We're also sleeping sufficiently, because sleep deprivation can cause hormonal imbalances. We can see an increase in cortisol over time, which is going to directly impair some of the physiological processes necessary to adapt. So that really is the perfect environment for long-term adaptations. Now, again, when it specifically comes to sleep, like I said, long-term sleep deprivation, that really is a recipe for disaster in the context of training adaptations. The hormonal imbalances, the effects on performance, all the negative effects that sleep deprivation have will no doubt lead to less progress over time and less results over time too. And this is no doubt something that just many people, again, they know this, like you alluded to, Mac, when it comes to just needing. You alluded to the fact that being an energy deficit kind of costs us some recovery. People know that sleep deprivation costs some recovery too, but again, whether or not they're willing to make it a priority in regards to addressing it as a priority or giving it the respect it deserves is a different story. So I guess there's some cognitive dissonance at play there, and it's really a matter, I think. So the thing about sleep as well is having less sleep today. So if I only have 3 hours of sleep today, that's not necessarily something I can actually make up for. So if I have 3 hours of sleep today, the detrimental effects of having less sleep have taken place. So my testosterone has been affected, my muscle protein synthesis has possibly been affected. And that's not something I can necessarily make up for. And people seem to think that they can make up for their sleep, and that can sometimes cause some fairly bad habits to be ingrained. Like people will accept some sleep loss today and try and make up for it in subsequent days. So I think the key here is finding a consistent routine with your sleep that involves a consistent wake to sleep schedule. So it's not just the hours of sleep that we're looking for here. It's really the wake to sleep schedule that you have. So what time do you wake up and what time do you go to sleep? The more consistent those times can be day to day, the greater the benefit your sleep is actually going to have on all of the factors that we deem important for our training adaptation. So it's really a matter of finding a consistent routine that you can somewhat uphold day to day for the most part, making sure that you're factoring in total number of hours slept as well. So my general recommendation to clients is around 7 hours of sleep. Once I see clients start to dip below 6 hours, probably a red flag that I start to address and then I discuss with them. And then obviously over 7 hours is great, but whether or not that's always feasible when we're working with people who have lives and busy jobs, etc., is another, I guess, question. But no doubt there's always something that can be done to somewhat improve sleep quality. Again, whether it's the wake to sleep schedule, trying to fit an extra hour in every day across the week, there's always something that can be done. And we definitely shouldn't dismiss the importance of sleep and really ensure it fits into this. We were sort of creating a bit of a triad here where we've got training management, we've got we've got nutrition strategies that correspond with our training. Then we've also got sleep. We really need to ensure that it fits into that triad and people understand that, because, we might not realize how sleep is negatively affecting us in the short term, but no doubt in the long term, those negative effects would be present. So something to consider there with sleep.
Yeah, totally. And I think, it's important for people to realize that acute sleep deprivation can impair performance, but having one night bad sleep, once a month where you have a crappy workout or whatever, probably isn't the end of the world. It's more so that chronic sleep deprivation that's going to impair long-term adaptations to training. That's what we need to really focus on. And that's why getting sufficient sleep, which is what I want you to discuss, Mac, and sort of define adequate sleep. Martin mentioned that he recommends at least 7 hours. But where do these figures come from, Mac? Why is it that, we recommend that athletes get at least 8 hours sleep per night? And, where do these numbers come from? And why is, sleep or more sleep beneficial? What are the mechanisms there?
To be honest with you, Jacob, I actually think that I'm not the best person to answer that question. I am not super well across the mechanisms behind sleep and what the literature, where we've got an 8 hours from. However, to my knowledge, it's been consistently shown that sort of 8 hours is the amount of time where you're getting the maximum, I guess, bang for your buck, as far as, or you're topping out recovery, I guess is probably a phrase that would make sense there, from sleep. But another thing that I wanted to mention here is, and maybe we could throw this one over to Dr. Martin, because honestly, I think he's going to know more about this than me, is I've seen a common theme in the discussions here, and that is the term kind of chronic or habitual. So we're focusing on habitual sleep patterns or sleep quality duration. However, we're focusing on habitual diet patterns, and then habitually managing your total training stress. And then also maybe we could create another offshoot from that, being like the overall life stress there, and understanding that, you might have immaculate training program and immaculate nutrition, but if you've got a really stressful job and you're also getting poor sleep, then you need to be realistic in what sort of training loads you can endure. So these are sort of like those big bang for things that, like Martin says, probably don't get the respect that they deserve. People lack respect for them. And then, everyone's focusing on the next tier, which would be like the 4 R's again. So around that post-exercise recovery window. And then at the top, we have those things that people maybe, like you said, Jacob, do once a week, which might be the whole hot, cold ice bath business. And I'm not even across the literature on how well that goes. I'm sure, again, Martin probably is across that one. So I'm going to palm this one off to someone who I think will know better answers on that one.
Martin, over to you.
So I can't exactly remember the question, but
it was the mechanisms of sleep. Like, why is more sleep better for recovery?
Yeah. So again, the degree to which I'd be able to answer this question would also be questionable. But basically, it is one of the main factors would be the regulation of hormones over time. So, like I mentioned earlier, chronic sleep deprivation, not a good idea. Cortisol, testosterone, all those important hormones that we hear get spoken about in the industry can be affected. And you may have heard of the testosterone to cortisol ratio, probably going to become more undesirable over time with chronic sleep deprivation. And, high cortisol that is or irregular to what we would normally term, baseline or healthy cortisol levels, that's going to definitely affect those physiological processes that I spoke about earlier that are energy expensive, for example, that we need to promote physiological adaptations. Now, another factor that sleep can affect is, and this comes back to what I mentioned earlier on in the discussion. So one aspect of fatigue is also cognitive fatigue, right? So it's not just the peripheral factors that are contributing to fatigue, but it's factors like our motivation, our arousal, our attention, our executive function, all of these cognitive factors are also going to play a role in how fatigued we are and how fatigued we actually feel. And, you know, feeling fatigued, that can definitely affect your performance sometimes it may not. There's definitely an interplay between the two there. And no doubt sleep will ensure that cognitively you are functioning as well as you possibly could be. And upon walking to the gym and lifting weights, you're kind of taking care of some of those cognitive factors that are also generally dismissed. Like I said earlier, people speak about fatigue and they speak about central fatigue and peripheral fatigue. And yes, learning purposes, that's great. But we also need to consider, I've got a great paper here that people can look at. So it is titled Fatigue and Human Performance, an Updated Framework. So very recent paper. And essentially I'm looking at a list of perceived cognitive fatigue factors. And sleep is going to play a role in influencing all these factors. So we have effort perception, motivation, affective valence, arousal, self-regulation, executive functioning, attention, interest, mood, stress, anxiety. All these factors are regulated to some extent by sleep. And insufficient sleep is not only going to reduce our ability to adapt to a training program, and research does show that sleep loss leads to less lean mass gain over time versus sleeping sufficiently. So it's not only influencing our ability to adapt, but it's also influencing our ability to perform via cognitive factors, likely, muscle related factors as well. And clearly there, if we're not performing very well, we're not going to induce and impose a stimulus that we otherwise could, right, if we were sleeping. And so that's going to lead to suboptimal adaptations. And then we'll also have the factor I mentioned earlier, where those adaptations, they're going to struggle to take place anyway, or at least to the extent that we want them to take place to, if sleep deprivation, chronic sleep loss, however you want to term it, if that's present. So hopefully that gives a bit of an overview of how sleep can affect our recovery.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that was pretty well explained, and it definitely makes a lot of sense as to how sleep has so many knock-on effects to many other areas that are going to impact recovery. So moving on to, I guess, the final, icing on the cake when it comes to recovery, supplements and all your voodoo, leg garments and things that are, topical creams and whatever the hell they come out with next week. Mac, how effective are these things? Obviously, hopefully the listeners by this point have realized that, these things are playing a very small role in the recovery process. But what's, I guess, a beneficial way to ice the cake, so to speak? And what are the fancy supplements and whatnot that are probably less effective and not worth the money?
Yes, I love the icing on the cake, as everyone does, right? So, really what I'm thinking about when we talk about the icing on the cake from a nutrition perspective, and that's what I'm going to focus on, of course, is we're talking about focusing on specific foods, but more likely we're focusing on supplements. When I think icing on the cake from a recovery perspective, I'm talking about supplements. Now, the thing with supplements is that, again, you don't have a place worrying about them unless you're nailing those big rocks first. You're better off dedicating your attention and time towards the big rocks before you start looking at supplements. But let's say you are nailing them consistently and you want to really dot your I's and cross your T's. So we need to look at the pros and cons of supplements in general. So for athletes in tested sports, there is always a risk of a positive anti-doping test, and this can occur for reasons that are really outside of our control, such as contamination. So if we are going to take a supplement, we really need to be sure that it's going to be worthwhile, because from that perspective, they're not risk-free. We also have potential interactions with nutrients that compete for absorption through the same pathways, and we might be running into certain deficiencies there. So all I'm trying to get across here is that people will often think, oh, let me just take a supplement because I can. It shouldn't just be, oh, because I can, because there's always a degree of risk involved, and that applies to recovery style supplements too. So there are a few supplements though that have some reasonable evidence behind them. And I guess I'm just kind of going to cover off a few of them, or the general categories. So obviously we have protein supplements. Okay, so that's just really helping someone eat enough protein. That's all it is. We can break them up even further. We've got, your regular fast digesting style ones such as whey, and then we have your pre-bed style slow release ones like a casein. I'm personally not convinced that a casein supplement is going to be worth it, even for those who are already dotting their I's and crossing their T's. Because I just think a protein-rich mixed meal, which, if it's got fiber and fats in it, it's going to slow that rate of digestion anyway. I think a mixed meal before bed is going to cover that one off just fine. So they're probably worthwhile supplements, but I probably wouldn't bother with casein. The other problem with casein is that you would then not be having a whole food source of protein. And when you're having whey protein with your morning oats, then post-exercise, then before bed, it's sort of like, hang on, there's a whole bunch of I guess, whole food proteins that I'm now missing out on. So that's the first category. There is also glycerol. So that actually has some reasonable evidence behind it, and it's a grade A supplement according to the Australian Institute of Sport supplement framework. So that's like basically it's a top tier one. What it essentially does is it can promote the retention of the fluid you drink. So it'll essentially promote hydration, and hydration being, if you are dehydrated, attaining a state of proper hydration is a big recovery factor. So having glycerol there might be of assistance, and it's something that you can literally just get from the pharmacy. And it's a bit of a surprise one. I almost guarantee you that most people probably haven't heard of glycerol as an ergogenic aid, if you will, or a sports supplement or something like that. The other big category is anything that will reduce inflammation, so like an antioxidant style supplement. So we're talking things like vitamin C, fruit polyphenols, your curcumins, your kind of tart cherry juices, even like beetroot juice. They're different in many different ways, but they all operate sort of on a similar mechanism, which is, hey, we're going to reduce inflammation. We're going to counter reactive oxygen species. So that sort of antioxidant thing where we're countering oxidative stress. Now, this is the thing with antioxidant supplements is around competition rather, when the priority is I want to perform like now, or I want to perform tomorrow, I want to perform as best as I can this weekend, and I need to do everything I can right now to recover. That's when supplemental doses of antioxidants have their place and purpose. But when you do this, it comes at the expense of long-term training adaptation, because you're blunting that initial inflammatory process, which underpins the degree. I guess it plays a role in the longer-term training adaptation. So the recommendation is to not take these things chronically, but just take them around competition. So for example, if you're a CrossFit athlete, and you're a week out, you might start to take some of these antioxidant supplements to make sure that you are able to perform your best on that day. And then there are a few other things like fish oils, if you're not eating fatty fish. In my view, from what I've seen, it doesn't look like the evidence is super duper convincing that there is going to be a meaningful benefit, but there are other reasons to ensure that your diet contains EPA and DHA fat, just general health reasons in particular. An interesting one, though, is magnesium. Now, this is something that typically gets touted as, I guess, a sleep supplement. It's going to help with cramps and all these sort of things. And at least from an exercise perspective, from what I've seen, that doesn't seem to be the case. And it seems like it's a heavily overrated supplement from an exercise recovery standpoint. And it's a grade C supplement, according to the Australian Institute of Sport supplement framework. So that really means that there's insufficient evidence, or the evidence does not support its benefits. And really, like any vitamin or mineral supplement, it's probably only going to be beneficial if you're deficient in it, if your diet doesn't provide the amount. And then, okay, well, how do I know this? Well, you've got to get tested. But then I understand the viewers here might be like, well, I can't be bothered doing that, or my clients definitely won't be bothered doing that. So if you were concerned that your diet doesn't provide enough magnesium, and you're worried that your recovery is compromised as a product of that, I would probably suggest taking a well-rounded, pretty decent, just general multivitamin. Because if we're just focusing on one thing and maximizing that, it can often come at the expense of other areas or the absorption of other nutrients. And this is just kind of a general rule.
Awesome. I love that. It was very thorough. You know your subs, Mac. Love it. So, Marto, when it comes to all of these other recovery tools beyond the supplements, your compression garments, your hot and cold therapies, where do they fit in? And do you think that they're worthwhile?
Yeah, I think for the most part, when it comes to strategies like using compression garments and ice baths, cold, hot water, post training, whatever it might be, cold, hot water immersion post training. I think for the most part, the evidence is somewhat mixed. And I'm not exactly sure where the exact consensus lies. I don't think they have the effect that some people seem to state. So there may be some very short term effects, but whether or not these effects are actually going to promote any improvements in long-term physiological adaptations is unclear. And really at the end of the day, that's what we are mostly concerned about is this strategy going to help improve our recovery, but is that then going to improve the physiological adaptations we experience in the long term? And a lot of the research that investigates the effect of some of these strategies is short-term in nature. So it's acute. A lot of these studies are set up to assess whether or not these strategies have a short-term effect on certain outcomes, whether that may be a performance outcome or a perceptual outcome, like less muscle soreness, for example, which might be rated, on a scale from 1 to 10. And so there are some takeaways that we can get from this research, but again, whether or not we can extrapolate it to the long run and conclude that it will positively improve the adaptations we experience from training is questionable. So in the short term, I'm sure there have been studies that have shown some positive effect. There have been studies that have shown, neutral effects, no doubt about that. Again, I'm not over all that literature, but you always have to weigh up the cost versus benefit of these strategies as well. So something to consider with pretty much all that we're speaking about today. Cost versus benefit needs to be considered. We've spoken about a lot of factors that have a very, high benefit, or at least we seem to think they have a large benefit on our recovery, and a very, minimal cost. It doesn't cost anything to allocate training variables in a strategic way, for example. And, some of these additional strategies that are often proposed to have a positive effect may come with a cost, whether that's a time cost, whether it's financial cost, needs to be considered, especially if you're a coach who is programming, these strategies. I know a very recent popular strategy is, so they're compression garments. They're like big boots that you wear, and I think I don't know what they do. They look like some sort of a compression. They look like they have some sort of a compressive effect. That's a time and a financial cost. No doubt, they're quite expensive, and you've got to sit there, for I don't know how long. So again, some clients, unless they're dedicated athletes, may not be able to dedicate themselves to that. And as coaches, it's just important we consider that cost versus benefit. So just the takeaways there, when you are presented with headlines that state compression garment improves recovery, or cold water immersion improves recovery, always consider that whether or not that's going to influence any potential long-term adaptations is questionable. Like, yeah, it may help you perform better over time, but again, we're just not sure whether or not consistently employing these strategies is going to have a positive effect long term. So something to consider there. And then also cost versus benefit when determining whether or not you should employ any strategy with a client or on yourself.
Yeah, I think the cost benefit ratio is definitely a concept that a lot of people absolutely need to consider when it comes to supplemental recovery strategies or any supplements at all. But guys, I think that was a very productive conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground on recovery. To recap, training and workload management is critical when it comes to recovering from training-induced fatigue. Get your proximity to failure, exercise selection and volume set appropriately so that you're getting obviously the right amount of stimulus, but an amount of fatigue you can recover from. Next, you got to nail down your nutrition. Energy availability has to be adequate, your protein, carbs, and fat. And then from there, sleep and everything else will follow. Anything else you guys want to add? If you had one recovery tip, Mardo, Mac, what would it be? We'll start with you, Mac.
One recovery
Energy availability.
tip, yeah,
Surely.
I mean, obviously that's the big rock as well.
Yeah.
You know, think about alcohol. That's probably a big one. I mean, we all know that it's not going to be conducive to recovery, but I think we need to remember that athletes, they're real people as well with, you know, a social life and what have you. And we need to put our critical thinking hats here. I've got mine on right now. And just to think about, okay, dose and frequency and things like that before we go and slam out athletes for having a drink with their mates on the weekend. Another one that I just want to raise, because I think it's kind of comical, is good old chalky milk. And it's actually something that gets a bit of attention as a recovery tool. And there's good reason for it. It ticks a lot of the boxes, easily digested, rapidly absorbed carbs and protein. It's dairy protein, so it's high quality. Being dairy as well, you've got a lot of electrolytes, and it's obviously a fluid, so it's going to promote hydration. The issues though being saturated fat and overall calories, which for a lot of people is going to be a problem. And also the amount of protein in it. Like you're going to have to have quite a lot of chalky milk to hit your leucine threshold. But yeah, that's probably all I would say about recovery modalities for today.
Awesome. Mardo?
I think, so I alluded to this earlier, but, you know, one, I guess, strategy that I would suggest employing is just the regular or somewhat consistent wake to sleep cycle throughout the week, trying to keep that somewhat consistent day to day. And I pulled up some of the research I alluded to earlier when I was discussing the effects that sleep deprivation can have on muscle protein synthesis, on cortisol and testosterone. And, you know, for example, and this research is out of Deakin University. So some of my colleagues actually recently conducted this research. So a single night of sleep deprivation can increase cortisol by up to 21% and decrease plasma testosterone by 24%. So that's a single night of sleep deprivation. And this I guess comes back to the point I alluded to earlier, where you can't really make up for that. Like that's already happened. Yeah, you can sleep more tomorrow night, but what's happened has already happened, and you can't really recover the debt that you incurred the day before. So essentially, what you're doing is you're putting yourself in a state of what we can say, you know, anabolic resistance, muscle protein synthesis decreasing, anabolic hormone levels are decreasing, cortisol's going up. It's a pro-catabolic environment. So I think from my perspective, if I'm going to suggest one strategy, it's try to keep a somewhat consistent wake to sleep cycle throughout the week. That's going to keep your total hours of sleep somewhat consistent as well, probably in a zone where we would say that's a sufficient amount of sleep. If you're an athlete, you need more. If you're a Gen Pop client, you can get away with less. You know, when it comes to the exact guidelines, like I said earlier, I usually say around 7 hours for the types of clients that I work with, and you know, getting them to the point where they do have a consistent wake to sleep cycle schedule throughout the week tends to keep things in place, and that's going to tick a box. So we've got that triad. It's going to tick that sleep box. And again, the cost of that is very low. Like there's no major costs to trying to keep things somewhat consistent throughout the week if you can. Sometimes easier said than done. Of course, like you mentioned, Mac, even athletes are human, and we have to consider that. But consistency always wins. And if you can strive to consider that a little more in your own, you know, fitness journey, I think it will have a positive impact long term.
Awesome. Guys, thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed that and took plenty away from the boys. Be sure to stay tuned for the next month's portal topic. And if you have questions, feel free to ask, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.